Okay, that's good to know. I'd like to welcome you to the fourth installment of the Wildfire Lecture Policy Lecture and Policy Lecture. Wildfire Lecture and Policy Lecture Series. Lots of lectures in there. This was enabled by generous donor support and co-hosted with the Santa Barbara County Fire Safe Council. Before starting, I would just like to thank the organizing committee that helps put this together, and also the staff that also plays a really critical role. And I've grown to greatly appreciate what the staff can do. With that, I'm pleased to introduce our speaker for today. This is Jessica Morse. Jessica earned her bachelor's degree at Principia College, followed by a master's of public affairs from Princeton in international relations and national security studies. She has considerable experience overseas, serving in various capacities in Nepal, Ethiopia, and Iraq, including service with USAID from 2005 to 2006, and also from 2012 to 2015. Most recently, she completed 4 years in the California Natural Resource Agency as Deputy Secretary for Forest Wildland Resilience, where she was the architect of California's new Wildfire Resilience Program. She continues to serve as a commissioner on the Federal Wildland Fire Mitigation and Management Commission. With that, I'm happy to have Jessica talk and to us about wildfire resilience and the various ways we can prepare and respond to create a more resilient future. So please give a hand to Jessica.
Thank you so much, Dar, and thank you to the entire UC Santa Barbara team here. I am so grateful to be here, and it's lovely to see all of you today. I would imagine that everyone has been impacted by fire in some way. Just raise your hands. How many of you have had to evacuate from a wildfire? Wow, yeah. How many of you have had to house fire evacuees? There you go, yep. How many of you guys have been impacted by smoke from wildfires? Yeah. How many of you guys have been impacted by mudslides from wildfires? Yeah, in this community. So, we see that the impact of fire touches all of us in California, and as we're seeing more and more, all of us around the globe. And for me, I'm actually 5 generations from Northern California. My family still has our original homestead forest land from the late 1800s, and so, like many California families, we're kind of land rich, cash poor, and end up trying to figure out how do we actually have our forests and our wildlands withstand the climate conditions that they are now facing that are historic. And so what I'm going to talk to you today about is how we got here, what the impacts we're seeing from fire, and then what do we do about it. Because turns out fire is very solvable, and we can be resilient and safe because California's actual ecology is fire resilient. And so we're going to get into that a little bit today, and then I'm going to talk about what we've done at the state and what we're doing with the feds to be able to implement fire resilience at scale. But first, because all of you understand firsthand the experience of fire, I just want to open with a story about some of my experiences with fire. I've done everything from, I had to evacuate from the King Fire in 2015 on foot. I was backpacking when it broke out and had to get out of there. But more importantly, when the Camp Fire broke out in Paradise, about 100 miles from my home, the day after that fire, I went up to go help. A friend of mine called and said, "We need all hands on deck up here." And I went up there, and that fire broke out in the early morning. And so everybody, when the evacuees were still in like pajamas and slippers and had fled from their homes, because the Camp Fire was a pace of fire that was unprecedented in California, right? Historically, when you'd get kind of a fire warning, you would have all day or several days to evacuate if it was several miles away. And the Camp Fire caught everybody by surprise because it moved 4 miles in a matter of less than an hour. And so it moved into this community really fast and caught people off guard, caught evacuation systems off guard, and was just moving with massive winds that were speeding it along. And so I was talking to a woman I was helping in one of the distribution centers, helping this woman get some food for her kids, some clothes, so that she wasn't just in her bedroom slippers. And And I think it was the first time that she had really paused since escaping that fire. And I could see that this was the moment that the adrenaline had finally drained from her. And so I just looked at her and looked her in the eyes and I said, "Do you need to talk about it?" And she nodded, and so she just held my hands for a few minutes and looked in my eyes and told me her story. And when she had dropped off her kid at daycare that morning, she was going to go home and start packing up the house and start getting ready to evacuate. And then as she got about 10 minutes away and realized that the fire was here and there was no other option, so she turned back, went to get her kid, and she and the other teachers there realized that the other parents weren't going to come. And so they loaded up all of these toddlers into her Suburban, and she drove through orchards to escape this fire. And then spent the rest of the day trying to figure out how the heck to reunite these toddlers with their parents in the middle of this chaos. Her car was totaled, but I think her morality and her spirit, was shocked as well. She had lost her home, and they had survived, right? People who are escaping fires often will say, "But I'm the lucky one," right? Because they're so grateful to be escaped with their lives, but the trauma really persists. And it was a level of trauma that I saw in her that I had not seen since I was on the ground in Baghdad as an active war zone. And I thought, this is happening to our community over and over. I mean, you all have seen it and experienced it here with the mudslides, and the impacts of these fires are dramatic and long felt, and communities take a while to reshape after that. And so I realized that my goal was to be able to figure out how we keep pace with this crisis. I asked myself in Paradise, after I was on the ground there for about a month helping with the recovery, I thought, how did we get here? How did it get to this point that we cannot handle fire in this country and in this community? And then I thought, what do we do about it, right? There's so many good solutions and ideas are out there. Why are they not actually making an impact against the scale of this crisis? And so that's what I spent the last 4 years doing, was working for the state, helping to come up with and uplift the really good innovative ideas that places like UC Santa Barbara have been pioneering, so that we can actually prevent catastrophes like Paradise. It is just not acceptable to have that level of trauma impacting community after community, year after year, right? And we've seen it now happening around the world with tragedies like Lahaina, that I never thought I would see something that could dwarf Paradise, but there it is. And so that's why I'm working on the federal level as well now, because all of us need to be able to elevate the latest innovation, and we need to move at a speed that actually keeps pace with this crisis. So now that I've depressed you, I might depress you a little bit more, but I want to talk to you about sort of the history and the ecology of fire for anybody who's not really a fire expert, although I imagine that there's probably even more expertise in the room than I'm bringing to the table. So this is showing us kind of the beneficial fire versus the catastrophic fires that we've been seeing lately, right? California's ecology is fire adapted. Whether you're talking about a chaparral community or pine forests, there is a specific fire return interval that those ecosystems are used to, right? In pine forests and oak woodlands and grasslands, it's usually like 15 to 20 years, depending on the region. Chaparral, there's estimates of much longer ranges. I'm sure that'll be a great point of debate here, but I've heard everything from 65 to 130 year fire return. But there is a fire adaptation and a fire resilience to these communities. And what's happened is that our pine forests that need fire on a regular basis have had fire suppression, which we'll talk about in a minute. But what that leads to is these catastrophic buildup of undergrowth, and then the buildup of undergrowth, and then the full total loss. Whereas what's supposed to be happening is fire's supposed to be coming through cleaning the forests out, and then leaving the strongest healthy trees behind. And then we've have the opposite impact in chaparral ecosystems, like you have down here, where you are actually getting too much fire, right? These ecosystems are adapted to not have fire every 15 years, but they have been getting fire every 15 years because of human ignitions, creating those sparks. And so they are overburning and then converting to cheatgrass and other invasive species. And whereas our forests, because they are getting too hot of fire and too few fires that are too few far between and then too hot, they're actually burning at high severity and then converting to chaparral. So we're losing classic ecosystems that we're really dependent on because the fire return intervals are off. So how did we get there? So in the California was actually actively managed by with fire by California Native Americans for millennia. There's estimates that California Native American tribes actively burned between 4 and 12 million acres a year in the Little Ice Age, but at a fraction of the emissions that we saw in like 2018 with about 1 million acres burned in the state. And what that tells us is that California Native American tribes were burning much larger acres at lower severity. So they were burning those kind of cleaning, healthy fires that helped germinate seeds, helped keep ecosystems healthy, whereas now we're getting these extreme hot fires. What happened in the forested ecosystems is that we ended up having the gold rush came through. Areas like the Comstock lode clear-cut the entire Sierra. We lost about 97% of our old-growth trees throughout our forests in California in that period. And what they replanted were weaker, homogeneous species, right? And then you have a political decision that happens. So as all of this clear cutting is happening, we start getting the conservation movement coming in and saying we have to protect public land, we have to set aside places. And so huge success, they established the Forest Service and they established national parks and public land, and you're starting to see public spaces come into play. But guess who hated public land? Congress. And so Congress decided that they would not fund the enforcers of public land. They were like, sure, you can have your public land, but people were going in and poaching trees and using that land regardless. And so they tried to cut the funding to the Forest Service. The Forest Service was established in 1905, and it was limping along. It wasn't going to make it. And so in 1910, you had a catastrophic burn. It's known as the Big Burn. And it burned across 4 states in, I think, 24 hours. I mean, it was just shocking for everyone at the time. Probably a shockwave similar to Paradise or Lahaina would be to us today. And it caught the nation's attention. And so Teddy Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot had been trying to present the Forest Service as a fire suppression entity to try to catch attention. Well, suddenly with the Big Burn, that sales pitch really worked. And so they said, guess what? The Forest Service, Congress, you fund us. We're going to get those fires out by 10 a.m. And so they ended up getting funding for the Forest Service with this condition that it had to be a fire suppression entity. Well, what does that eliminate? That eliminates these clean, healthy fires that these ecosystems needed, especially as they were forests that were trying to come back, trying to be healthy. Instead, you had all of those densely packed, homogeneous trees then growing on top of each other in high density with nothing to thin them out or to clean them out. And so for me, that lesson, because 100 years later, we are paying the price for that policy decision. And I'm not here to tell you whether it was a right or wrong decision, right? Because we did get public land out of it, right? And conserved areas, which is really valuable to us. But they made a political trade-off with the science of the day. And that, for me, when I came into this policy role, was really critical, that we find a way to get the politics to follow the science rather than adjust the science to the politics. Because I don't want people looking back at us 100 years from now and saying, thanks a lot, guys. You landed us with a tough one. And so this was our opportunity to get it right. And so I kept that political lesson from 1910 in my mind as we were designing a new approach to fire, because we can't think in terms of political cycles with this. We have to think in terms of the ecological cycles, which are 100+ years, right? We have to think long-term and multi-generationally, which does not fit neatly, let me tell you, into a state or congressional budget cycle. But what we saw is that we need to fix it, because what happened is that these homogeneous tiny trees and the 10 a.m. policy and Smokey the Bear, who I am not convinced he's my friend, And they all led to these overly dense forests, right? Scott Stevens at UC Berkeley has estimated that we have right now about 400 trees per acre in the Sierra, and we're supposed to have about 40 is what the ecological conditions can have. And so what happened is that when you have climate change hit on top of these incredibly dense, already weak forests, they're not resilient to the climate conditions we're having. So when you had a massive drought strike in California in 2012 to 2015, and then it actually persisted all the way until last year, that once in 1,000-year drought that we had hit California really overtaxed these overly dense trees. This is a photo of trees that were killed by the bark beetles, which come from the drought. So if anybody, I'm sure a lot of you know here, but for those of you who don't, we have beetles in the forest. They're a native species. They're supposed to die out every winter and have their populations cut back by freezes. We had warmer winters, so their populations went unchecked, and then the trees use sap as their defense. So when trees are drought stricken, they don't have the sap to push the beetles out, and so they succumbed. So you had in some areas around in the southern Sierra, 90% tree mortality. So between 2012 and 2015, at the early stage of this drought, we had 169 million trees die throughout the Sierra. Then enter unprecedented heat in 2020. And what you end up with is those dead standing trees from 2015 started hitting the ground in 2020. CAL FIRE estimates that our fuel load when we're doing fire behavior models are about 3 inches of 3-inch diameter of little sticks and twigs that make up the fuel bed. But instead, what you actually had on the ground were 30-inch diameter trees on the ground, which Dar can tell you that LIDAR could have told you. And so you had 30-inch diameter trees on the ground. And so it created this phenomenon that we started seeing more and more called standing combustion, which is where you have, it's burning so hot that it has an active flame throughout the entire footprint of the fire. You're talking like an active flame throughout 80,000 acres, right, on some of these big fires, rather than a typical fire model, which is a smoldering center and an active fire front. And so the heat signature on that is off the charts, right? So it starts creating these pyrocumulus clouds. This one is the Creek Fire in 2020, which was a pyrocumulus that was 50,000 feet in the air. And so it created its own weather system that when it came crashing down, it goes out in a diameter and kind of goes like a splat and pushes hurricane force winds out in every direction on the ground. Imagine trying to fight that fire. Sorry, I don't want to lose my voice on you guys. So what we saw is, again, to sort of pull it all together, we've seen overly dense forests from overlogging plus fire suppression. Then you see climate change enter, dry out those forests, kill them, then they become a fuel bed. You have extreme heat conditions that dry out that fire. Before the Creek Fire started, you saw moisture conditions in the fuel at 6%. Just to give you a perspective, kiln-dried lumber is 12% moisture, right? So this is drier than professionally dried wood when you're getting those like 100+ degree days in these areas. And so it creates these conditions for these mega fires that are unprecedented. And so it's that combination both of fuel loading and climate change that is up against us, right? And so we had to do like incredible things. Like this was an airlift done by the National Guard out of Huntington Lake for that fire. It was amazing that the Creek Fire had no fatalities. We had put fuel breaks on the ground in advance that allowed evacuation corridors and allowed us to be able to get into these parking lot areas to get hikers out. But you still saw unprecedented fires in 2020, right? Because the 2020 lightning strike fires started right after an extreme heat wave. Right, we had 4.5 million acres burn in 2020 in California. And we had 250,000 people evacuated at one point for those fires. So you just think about the scale of that. In 2020, and you guys are seeing the consequences of those fires too, right? In 2021, we had more unprecedented fires with the Caldor fire and the Dixie fire. The Caldor fire and the Dixie fire were the first two fires in pyrologic history to ever go up and over the Sierra Nevada. I remember being at the Caldor fire around Lake Tahoe when it broke out, and what we ended up seeing were the I was talking to the fire chief at the base camp, and I was saying, is it possible that it could cross like the Sierra? I mean, these are 500-foot granite cliffs. And he was like, well, last week I would have told you no, but it just crossed the Sierra in in the Dixie fire in the northern Sierra. So this granite fuel break essentially was not sufficient because we saw the fire jumping 500-foot cliffs, spotting miles in advance. And so the question is, like, how do we get ahead of this curve? And as we know, like, the consequences they reverberate down once you have these big high severity fires, right? Like you had here in Santa Barbara with the mudslides in Montecito, right? Those come on the fire scars and they cause mudslides and disasters. That's also happening in our upper watersheds. So you're getting, with the Dixie fire and the Caldor fire and the Tamarack fire, these were fires all in the upper watersheds of the Sierra that had high severity burn scars. That means I went up to the Dixie fire and the soil was hydrophobic, meaning that it had essentially turned into a clay layer because it had burned so hot. So right after the Dixie fire, that million-acre first gigafire, that fire burned so hot that even though it got 11 inches of rain that finally put it out in October of 2021, the soil underneath was still dry because it was this clay layer on top, which meant that none of the water was percolating into the watershed the way it should. Instead, it was just running down and creating siltification in our reservoirs and creating, destroying fish habitat. The consequences of these extreme fires are really intense. And so the impacts are unprecedented. This shows you what's happening in our upper watersheds in the Sierra Nevada. This is the annual acres burned in the Sierra Nevada in California starting in 1920 until 2010. And this is 2020, and then this is 2021, right? You're at like over 1 million acres each year, 2 years in a row. And remember, 60% of California's water comes from the Sierra Nevada. So what you end up are these compounding climate cycles where high severity fire, then drought causes high severity fire, which then causes extreme losses to your watershed, which exacerbates drought, which exacerbates fire. And so we needed to get ahead of it. It was urgent. But I have hope for you. Now that you're all like, shocked here. Actually, you guys have lived it, so you're not shocked. But who wants to guess where this healthy, lovely forest is? Here's a healthy Jeffrey pine forest. You can see that it has like cleared out undergrowth and some like mixed age classes in there of trees, some older trees, smaller trees. Who wants to guess where in the world this forest is? Show of hands. What do you think? Where do you think it is? Yeah. Sierras. Who else has a guess?
Kind of looks like San Jacinto State Park.
In Mexico?
In Angeles.
At Angeles. Okay. What do you got? Santa Barbara Tunnel Trail. Okay, this is looking familiar to people. Anybody else?
Figueroa.
What? Figueroa. Okay. Okay, we have a clear expert in the room. Yes. So this is in Mexico, and it's at a higher elevation, but it's at a lower latitude, right? It's going to get higher and hotter and drier conditions. And so when we ask ourselves, what does the future of our forest look like? Can our forest actually withstand the climate crisis? The answer is yes. Yes, here is a healthy forest that was never logged and has been maintained with natural fire throughout its entire life cycle. And so it is able to withstand hotter and drier conditions. And so we know that our forests can actually withstand the hotter conditions if we have them resilient And so the question is, how can we get back to these conditions? And so there's two key partners, in addition to all the local partners. Like, you need to have your state, federal, tribal, local partners all fully engaged to be able to succeed here. And so, because it turns out a fire doesn't sort of pause and say, oh, is that federal land? Let me take a turn. And so we're trying to make sure that we get this in track. And so when I came into the state administration on wildfire resilience, we started in 2020 a partnership with the U.S. Forest Service and a commitment that included treating 1 million acres a year. And then California said, all right, here's our plan to be able to actually get that partnership done. You can go read the California Wildfire and Resilience Task Force Action Plan. It's essentially sort of, I'll be kind of talking you through it, but it's essentially showing us all of the key steps we need to take to be able to hit that. And now I'm on the Federal Wildland Fire Commission, and we just released our report last week, and we are seeing that it's very similar steps to what California has done, but at the federal level. And so to be able to get to a fire resilient state, it takes all hands on deck. It's going to take full partnerships and a scale up of resources. And California actually has a model that is starting to work, right? It is giving us clear examples that we can actually survive and thrive in a wildfire future. And so I want to talk to you about what we've done at the state and how we're trying to mirror that at the feds. So the first is you have to invest in wildfire resilience. This is California's scaled up investment in wildfire. We went from having the first funding for resilience, and I'm going to talk to you all about what's actually getting funded here. I'll define resilience and everything. In 2018, right after Paradise, and $200 million a year, and then we ramped that up to $3 billion over 3 years for the state. And within the first year of that program being on the ground, we saw a savings in our state emergency fund just for suppression alone of $2 billion. So this funding started to hit the ground in 2021. And by the 2022 fire season, we saw a reduction from 2.5 million acres burned in 2021 to 366,000 acres burned in 2022. We saw a reduction in homes lost from about 1,200 homes lost in 12,000 homes lost in 2021 to down to about 700 homes lost and structures lost in 2022 with this increase in funding. And we're seeing that trend continue to go down. And what's interesting about this difference is that we had the same number of fires and the same high severity fire conditions between 2021 and 2022, right? We didn't start getting rain until the end of the year in 2022. This fire season has also been very mild, but I credit that more to the rain in addition to our excellent work. And all of your excellent work, because this is a partnership. So when we're talking about funding that resilience, there's really 3 fronts of fire resilience, and they are all needed to succeed. And so it is across the interventions inside of the community, so that's home hardening and defensible space. I'll talk about that more. The external one, right around communities, interventions include strategic fuel breaks around communities that slow that fire down, create evacuation routes, and give firefighters the ability to take a stand against a fire, and then really restoring whole landscapes so that they are back to fire resilience, right? In chaparral ecosystems, you're talking about reducing ignitions so that they're able to have that hardened hard pack underneath. In forested ecosystems and grasslands, you're talking about increasing fire and grazing, and sometimes doing by hand what fire had to do for the last was supposed to have done for the last 100 years. So on the landscape level, this is where we're really trying to get our upper watersheds to function again and be really healthy. And so we've made investments in programs across and I can get into more details on all the programs, but for every type of landowner, we have funding specifically for tribal partners. We have funding specifically for small landowners, which make up almost 46% of the forest lands held in California. We're making up, 26% of the forest lands are small forested landowner, 40% is privately held. There we go, we're getting there. So it was for small forested landowners. We have funding for grants on federal partnerships for a lot of the local land partners as well. And so we tried to make sure that we were targeting resources to everybody who is already doing this work so that they could get dollars in and projects on the ground as quickly as possible. And so we're trying to get, that includes like some of your parks and national forests around here. So in 2021, we got emergency funding right out the gate and got projects on the ground very quickly. And what we were able to do is get everything from chaparral ecosystems to giant sequoias to grasslands with grazing to get those projects ready. So, and my goal was to get them done in time for the 2022 fire season. But we were able to move so quickly because we changed some of the contracting rules and some of our internal processes and grant timelines. Some of these projects got on the ground within 4 weeks and were able to actually stop fires at the end of 2021, including the Alicel fire here outside of Santa Barbara. But what we saw is that these landscape scale projects make a huge difference in the upper watershed. So this was the North Complex fire in 2021. This was a project done by the Sierra Nevada Conservancy where they had done hand thinning underneath this forest. And so you can see that the fire burned at incredibly high severity until it hit the project. And then it actually continued burning, but it burned underneath the forest. That is just fuel reduction alone that gave us that green spot. We also saw the same thing with the Caldor fire outside of Lake Tahoe. How many of you guys know the area of Kirkwood? It's a little ski area. Sometimes people go up there, great hiking. There was a 3,000 acre prescribed fire that was done called the Caples Burn. And it's actually, for those of you in the fire community, the Caples Burn was kind of the cautionary tale of prescribed fire, right? It was supposed to be 1,000 acres. They had to call in suppression. It burned 3,000 acres. But it burned at low severity for the whole fire. So that a couple years later, the Caldor fire comes raging through at high severity and it hits that 3,000 acre Caples Burn and it looks like this, where you have a 3,000 acre spot of sea of green right outside of Kirkwood and it saved the town from the Caldor fire, as well as all that ecology. So the next area, so those are the landscape projects. The next layer in are projects that are the fuel breaks around communities. And sometimes when you think of fuel breaks, you're thinking of like bulldozers coming in during a firefight, right, which happens during the fire. But when you have advanced planning, you can actually do shaded fuel breaks, which are ecologically beneficial. And so they're often along roadsides. You're essentially clearing out the underbrush and creating a safer evacuation corridor. They are not designed typically to just put out a fire on their own. They are designed as a tactical tool to aid evacuation during a fire and to allow firefighters a safe place to stage their equipment and approach the fire. And so we saw an amazing result of fuel reduction projects in the Caldor fire. Again, this funding had gotten on the ground very quickly, as well as some previous projects that had been done in the Tahoe Basin and also along Highway 50, if you guys know Northern California, that were able to actually slow the Caldor fire significantly. And so here is the Caldor fire in the Tahoe. How many of you guys remember the Caldor fire was burning down in Lake Tahoe in 2021? And so you evacuated the Tahoe Basin. When the Caldor fire broke out, just so you guys have a sense, we have technology that does fire modeling, that when a fire breaks out, within the first couple hours of that fire, you have a model that shows you how big that fire is going to be without suppression. And when the Caldor fire broke out, it was one of the biggest fires that the fire modelers had modeled. So it broke out and it was projected without any intervention that it was going to burn from all the way down to the outskirts of Sacramento and then all the way up over the Sierra Nevada and in through the entire Tahoe Basin and not stop until Reno. So it was designed to be catastrophic in highly populated areas because the conditions were so dry, right? When the fire started, how many of you guys have hiked in Desolation Wilderness? Any of you guys get up there? You know, it's all granite, right? So I was at, I heard them call over the radio with the Caldor fire. They're like, it's burning at Lake Aloha. And I was like, There's nothing to burn there. It is just granite, right? Trees are like 500 feet apart, but it was so dry that every ember was causing a new fire because the conditions were so ready for fire. So this is the Caldor fire. The brown in this image is what was coming in at high intensity. And then the orange and the yellow were the highest high severity coming into the Tahoe Basin. So this is the town of, this is Christmas Valley. There's the Tahoe area. You can get into South Lake up there. And so for those of you who kind of know this area, this is coming up and over the pass down into Christmas Valley, right? There's, I think, Highway 50 right over there. And so it was burning at high severity. The green patches are all of the fuel reduction projects that have been done. And if you can see here, this is all suburb density houses in these communities. And they are not new houses, right? These are old homes. But the community had done a really good job on defensible space. They had cleaned out their gutters. They had done a lot of like work on removing fuel from around the homes. Through the Tahoe Conservancy, we had funded projects that allowed them to take all the vacant lots in these neighborhoods and thin them out so that they were healthy forests rather than overgrowth. And so we had a lot of the fuel reduction in the neighborhoods reduced. Then we had these fuel breaks, these green fuel breaks and patches around the neighborhoods, so that when you had this high severity fire burning down into these neighborhoods like here, you saw flames that were 150 feet off the ground, right? So that's a 15-story building of fire marching down to these communities. And when it hit the fuel breaks, those flames dropped from 150 feet to 15 feet. And so what that meant is those firefighters, 600-foot wide fuel breaks, not a big thing. I was on the ground in the Caldor fire the day they lifted the evacuation orders. We were looking at the efficacy of these fuel breaks with CAL FIRE. I was there with the CAL FIRE chief. And we were looking at, you could see the burn scars on the trees, right, from where it was hitting. And going from like completely nuked forest to then green top trees with the fire scars getting lower and lower to the ground until you saw black ground underneath that went all the way up to the property lines, and then it stopped, right? And you could see the fire hoses were still there. Little areas that the firefighters had stomped out embers were still smoldering, right? But they had stopped it. This homeowner comes back, and I'm standing with the fire chief, and she looks at him and she says, "Did you guys backburn off of my property here?" Because she's seeing the fire scar right up to her fence. And fortunately for her, it was a chain link fence. Good job. And we say, "No, that's the fire." And she burst into tears and hugged the CAL FIRE chief, and he was crying and I was crying. And because that whole neighborhood was saved, because of this incredible hard work that everybody had put in place to give those firefighters the opportunity to save this home and this whole neighborhood, right? What's amazing too is that one of the fire chiefs who was leading a lot of the Caldor fire efforts and had been actually instrumental in getting these fuel breaks, he lived in Christmas Valley in this neighborhood. And so he was out there at fire base camp directing people while his home was under direct threat, and it was saved, which was amazing. And so what we're seeing is that these fuel reductions can work. So this is another example of a fuel break in the Oak Fire in Placer County. This one was just this last year. This was a fire that was predicted to be a mega fire. You probably never heard of it. It was spotting a half a mile in front. It was creating new fires a half a mile in front of the flames. The fuel break actually landed, the fire actually landed in the fuel break that we had done. And this is a fuel break that CAL FIRE had done with the California Native Plant Society. So not only is it a safe fuel break, but it's also monarch butterfly habitat. And so the fire landed in the fuel break and they were able to suppress it very quickly. And so this was modeled to be a mega fire and it didn't become one. This is the Alisal fire that broke out outside of here in 2021. This was a fuel break that was funded early on. We got the project on the ground within 4 weeks of getting the funding. So by the time the fire broke out in the fall, it had been grazed. So this is the area that had been grazed by sheep. This was the area that was all mustard and had not been touched. It was different land ownership, which we're working on. but it came across and it hit the fuel reduction area, and it stopped. And so that meant that they were able to free up resources and had one front of the fire preserved. I think it's the Arroyo Honda Reserve. Does that sound familiar to anybody? Yeah, that we had done that work on. And so what we saw is that these investments, and this is just CAL FIRE's numbers the last few years, the investments in wildfire fuel reduction allowed us to start scaling up annual acres treated, which means thinned out by different tactics, every year, so that we're starting to hit about 100,000 a year through CAL FIRE alone. Once you start adding in the other departments and agencies around the state, like this year we were at 150,000 acres, and that's a significant undercount. And if you start adding in then the Forest Service and the grants we're giving to private landowners, we're probably closer to 500,000 acres. And so those exact numbers are coming out soon. That's why we have LiDAR. And so that we can actually start counting that more. So the last area, so again, these three fronts of resilience are really critical, right? You have the landscape work, the work around communities like those fuel breaks that make a huge impact, and then you need the work inside of the community, right? Defensible space home hardening. Who's heard of defensible space home hardening? Oh, good job, you guys. All right. Who's done defensible space home hardening on your own? Okay, well, we'll get there. So what this is really critical, because what we've learned and what our studies are showing us is that homes burn from the inside out in a wildfire, right? It is embers getting in through the attics and vents. It is plants up against your windows and single pane windows that then burst, flames get in, the house fails, right? So if you can keep your house structurally sound on the outside, keep heat off of it directly, and keep embers out of it, then you have a much higher chance of succeeding. And we're constantly updating California's defensible space and home hardening building codes because the science is telling us new things, right? After the Marshall Fire in Colorado, which burned down a suburban community outside of Boulder, do you guys remember that one? The studies showed us that it was actually the fences between the community that carried the fire house to house, right? And so changing your fences is really critical to having your neighborhood stand. The other thing we know about home hardening and defensible space, that your individual action is important, but collective action is more critical, right? In Paradise, you saw that the trees, you saw this in Coffee Park as well in Santa Rosa, the trees were still green, the houses were gone, right? Once it becomes an urban infiltration rather than a wildfire, you have a heat signature on that house that starts burning. Once a house goes up, it burns at a much hotter temperature than anything you'll see in nature. And so it is going to ignite the whole neighborhood unless you have a saturation level of home hardening in that community to keep, to prevent even one house from going up in that neighborhood. And so collective action here is really crucial. And we can talk more about tactics in the Q&A on this. But getting that defensible space and home hardening, and California has integrated home hardening into our building codes starting in 2008. And so if you look at Paradise, where again, you didn't have necessarily the saturation levels, but you just have the examples of the building code standing alone, homes built after 2008 had a 60% survival rate in the campfire. Homes built before 2008 had a 10% survival rate. So retrofitting our homes so that they have these building codes in them is really crucial. That was also part of the tragedy we saw in Lahaina, right? You didn't have building codes. And so once the neighborhood went up, it was really hard to get ahead of it. As we can talk more about lessons from that as well. So there's a couple other aspects to this too, because we invested in projects from across different partners, everybody from fire safe councils to local land trusts to the Forest Service to state parks to Fish and Wildlife, to be able to get this work done across the landscapes and to get these projects directly done. But we also needed to increase our science and ensure that everything we were doing was keeping pace with science, because we want to learn the lesson of Teddy Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot and ensure that what we are putting on the ground is actually going to have that 100-year impact. We wanted to invest in in better regulatory reform because we couldn't wait for these projects, couldn't wait for our processes. So we got our processes down from 2 years down to about a month to get projects on the ground in some areas, especially for these critical fuel breaks. And so we're trying to adapt government to the speed of the crisis. We also invested in the wood economy because one of the challenges you have up in your forested areas are slash piles. That as you're creating this fuel reduction, you are getting massive slash piles building up. I don't know if you guys can see me in this picture. That's me, right? Just to give you a sense of the scale of this. A few years ago, the Forest Service estimated that there were 400,000 of these slash piles in the Tahoe Basin alone. And so, you know, you can open pile burn that in the winter, but that's also what caused a prescribed fire in New Mexico to get out of hand, was a slash pile that kept smoldering and smoldering and smoldering. But there's other uses that would be safer, right? Because when you have these during a firefight in the Caldor fire, there are some of these outside of a town called Pollock Pines. We had to actually put whole fire units and fire engine crews on one slash pile. To be able to keep it watered down so it didn't go up like a Roman candle and complicate the firefight even further. And so getting rid of these has been really crucial and ensuring that as we're doing fuel reduction, we're finding destinations. Fortunately, there's some really cool science happening as well as some really traditional stuff of what you can do with this, right? If you can actually get lumber out of this, you can sequester that sucker into a house in a way that's really helpful, right? There's also ways to turn it into dimensional lumber, which is a manufactured wood that replaces steel and concrete I-beams in buildings. California just changed our building code so you can have up to 18 stories, skyscrapers built out of wood. So imagine that being wood rather than cement. And I'm sure it's great though. So trying to think about other ways that you can sequester it. There are also ways that you can just use it that's more beneficial than open pile burning. So from a carbon standpoint, right, you can get it into next generation technology that we're trying to develop that allows you to have a carbon negative cycle by turning it into I think liquid hydrogen. There's ways that you can put it into next generation biomass to energy that can convert it to electricity. Even cooler is if you can convert it to renewable natural gas. It prices out better in the economy. And so there's, and you can also just turn it into like wood chips, or I saw somebody turn it into lotion. You can turn it into, there's somebody who's breaking it down to like the nanocellular level and turning it into kind of a really strong glass. So there's some very cool stuff that you can do with this, and there's a lot of innovation happening, I'm sure even here, on what do you do with what's traditionally wood waste? How do you turn that into a way that can replace fossil fuels, or even better, find ways to permanently sequester it? You can, when you're doing it, there's different ways to burn it that are less carbon intensive, like in some types of air curtain burners that are coming out, where it creates a biochar that is actually, I call biochar the fairy dust of the forest, right? When you do it right and it doesn't have a bunch of tar in it, you can actually feed it to cows to reduce their own methane in the cattle feed. It actually improves milk yield in the cattle as well. And you can also put it back into the forest and the upper watersheds. It's a really good way to retain moisture in a watershed and actually increase your water storage and your nutrient storage on the land itself. So there are many things you can do with this work. And so what we did is said, okay, this is not being sort of market driven by itself, right? It's hard to have some of these new technologies, especially in energy, compete with solar or wind. But there are ways to try to subsidize. You can subsidize the transportation of this stuff so you get it moving to destinations. We created low interest loans so that people could start up businesses. We created sort of like XPRIZE type grants for the next generation carbon negative cycles with this product, so that we could scale them up like a $50 million grant program to be able to get those going. And so we put about $200 million into different projects that do small businesses to big businesses to get the wood economy moving again. We even put in a micro mill outside of Greenville, like this is an example of a micro mill, that will help you replace you guys probably, I don't know how much you know on Northern California, but a few years ago, we lost the town of Greenville in the Dixie Fire. And so they were having to ship salvage wood from Greenville 80 miles down the road to the nearest mill. So we got a grant up there to open a mill 5 miles down the road in a town called Crescent Mills, which amazingly didn't have a sawmill. And so got a small mill opened up there. We adapted a grant, had it open within 6 months of the fire. And so now you're driving the wood 5 miles down the road, milling it 5 miles back to rebuild the houses and the fences in the community, in the neighborhood. And so thinking about everything from traditional to innovative has been really crucial. And that's where universities are really incredible in helping us come up with the next generation technology to solve these problem sets. So, and then the workforce development is really important too. How many of you guys have ever worked with the California Conservation Corps or heard of them? Okay, well, we need more hands here in this room. The California Conservation Corps is an amazing program that is working with youth from often lower income or higher risk communities and bringing them in to a structured program. And so we developed out of the Conservation Corps a program specific for the Forestry Corps so that they could do year-round fuel reduction and then get a career pathway where they can get scholarships into colleges or direct hire into CAL FIRE or any state service right out. CAL FIRE just hired out of these fuels crews 400 Corps members over the last 2 years into CAL FIRE, into permanent careers. And so we're trying to create entry level and expand the entry level workforce here so that we can create permanent careers. We've also been investing in forestry programs at community colleges. We've been partnering with universities as well in the UC system to invest in the fire advisor program, the UC Natural Resources program, so that we have more fire advisors in the community. We've also invested in a program called the CHIPS program that partners with 8 California Native American tribes in the Sierra region that establishes training and workforce for both prescribed fire and fuel reduction, and then they get hired on the state and federal projects to do that work. So you're creating these workforces as you're going along. So this program has been incredibly effective. We know that the model works, and so my role on the Federal Wildland Fire Commission was to take what we've done in California and integrate all of these lessons learned and projects that are working into the federal level so that our federal partners, who own actually 57% of the forest land in California, can actually keep pace with the work we are doing. And so what we're seeing here is that these investments in resilience work. The next generation ideas that you guys are pushing and the ideas that have come out of the universities, we are integrating them into state policy. We are scaling them at an unprecedented scale, and we are seeing that unprecedented scale pay off. It is incredibly clear that fire is not going to be just a straight line down of progress, right? We are going to have good years, we are going to have bad years. But what we can see is that the investments of resilience lower the negative impacts of fires. It helps save lives, it helps save homes, and it helps save our ecology. And so I am so grateful for all of the research and innovation that you guys are doing, because the state of California and the feds are eating it up. And we are trying to implement it at scale. And that is how we are going to solve this problem, not just for the next generation, but for the generations to come, so that they will look back on all of the work that we have done here and say, thank you, you did it right. So thank you for coming today, and excited to take questions. Yeah.
Okay, okay, thank you. I actually have a series of questions that we thought we might talk about. But actually, I think Jessica did a pretty fantastic job of covering almost everything I actually wanted to ask her.
Oh, no.
And so I think what we'll do is kind of let you pick and choose which one you feel we didn't get a chance to cover well. Like, for
Yeah.
example, there's the one about smoke. Is that one you would like?
Yeah, let's talk about smoke impacts.
Okay, so let's talk about smoke impacts. So here's the question. What have we learned about the impacts of smoke, and what people might be able to do to protect themselves?
Yeah. So, I think smoke impacts is kind of the next level of fire, right? I kind of went through everything that we've gotten really nailed down, and smoke is this next generation of study that we are just over the last 5 years really starting to break into and understand. And so what we're seeing is that smoke impacts isn't just sort of what you would automatically think about with like lung cancer and stuff like that. It is, you see when people are exposed to PM 2.5, the particulates in smoke, what you're seeing is actually an increase in risk of heart attack and stroke among older people. You are seeing an increase in risk of asthma, childhood asthma in younger populations. You're also seeing mental health impacts, right? One of the theories that we're trying to work with, Stanford's been doing some of this work. I think you guys are doing some of this work here too, I think, where these public health smoke departments are coming together, and they're starting to understand that distinction where they're starting to see that mental health there's a huge negative impact after being exposed to PM 2.5 over a long period. And so we're seeing high suicide rates among firefighters and EMTs writ large, but trying to explore whether or not there's a correlation there between the mental health impacts on firefighters and their smoke exposure and what we can do to limit their smoke exposure during a firefight. And so as we're starting to get into these conversations with like the prescribed fire community, right, we don't want them to get caught up in the negative impact in our clean air regulations, right? So what we're trying to figure out is, because you can know when a prescribed fire is happening, it's still, you don't say, we say good fire and bad fire, it's like a bit simplistic, but there's not good smoke and bad smoke, right? All smoke exposure is bad, there's just different levels that you're getting exposed and different health impacts at those different levels. And so when you're doing prescribed burns, the goal is to make sure you're doing those on days when the smoke actually lifts up and out of the community, so that you're not going to get smoke layers down there, but also integrating into our prescribed burns the same sort of standards we would have around keeping the community safe from fire. It's keeping them safe from smoke, saying, hey, we're going to have a prescribed burn over the next 3 days. Make sure you wear your N95 masks. Make sure that you have air filters and that we have clean air centers in schools. And so thinking about how we can create every school to be a clean air center, so that when you have bad fire days, you're ready. When we have prescribed burns, we're ready, right? Because what we don't want is the solution to fire to be slowed down by we actually want to mitigate the smoke impacts from prescribed fire and then further mitigate so that we're not having then the catastrophic fires inundating everyone in these communities with smoke. But it's hard to see, right, when you're out, when you see people in Washington, D.C. and New York this summer, smoke is everywhere and everyone's still sitting at cafes outside, like enjoying their coffee. And I was like, no, this is very dangerous air. Take it seriously, right? Or people that like, oh, I don't want to cancel my vacation because of the smoke. And so like helping people have better smoke hygiene practices is going to be really important, and probably the next level of fire and public health.
Okay, so we have we have a reception coming up. So I think we really only have time for maybe one more sort of kind of question we might discuss. And I thought we might try this one. How might we better link the research community to policy and planning around wildfire? And then what role might the research community play in mitigating wildfire impacts and preparedness?
Yeah. So there are some very cool things happening with science and research here. One of the things I loved about working for the state of California, and also working, most of your fire policy experts are fire scientists, whether you're at or ecologists at some level, right? All of your foresters at Cal Fire and state parks, right, are all have some type of degree in forestry or biology, and come in through these paths. And so you have a lot of people who are really excited about science in the policy roles, myself included. And so what we saw is that we made a forward investment in not only the science and data that we had available, so that all of these decisions about where should we put these fuel breaks, what's the future coming in, how should you use grazing, or should you use prescribed fire, or does this require a hand crew, right? That these opportunities needed science to tell us that. What's the state of our watersheds? Where do we target our reforestation dollars after fire to know what to do? And so we made a huge investment in LIDAR We actually did 30 million acres of the state in LIDAR so that it gets us essentially all of our high fire risk areas in the state now have current LIDAR, or we're flying LIDAR so that it will be current within like the last 5 years. We made sure we flew that over the previous fire scars. We're also investing in like better satellite imagery so that you can get some of that hyperspectral data as well. We're also investing in like ground LIDAR. We've been putting in, what's it called, a flex tower. In the first time we had a flex tower in the Coast Redwoods, see? And that's an amazing project because it allows you to be able to see what type of water is coming off the trees and you guys actually probably know more about it than I do. It's supposed to be very cool. And essentially help us anticipate climate challenges and how trees are responding in those local ecozones. But integrating that science is one thing just to collect the data, right? We're also investing in research projects. And so I know that you guys got, UC Santa Barbara got a grant to be able to do some fuel reduction projects from us. But that's why we invested in the fire science advisors, so that when we're working, they are designed to go into the community and work with fire safe councils and local organizations so that you have the latest, you have somebody translating science to practical on the ground projects. And we have 11 of those people now around the state, which is really exciting. And we're investing in research projects next generation too, because what I want to know is how much water yield increases when you thin out the forest, right? Because right now in our upper watersheds, when you have 400 trees per acre, and not only is that bad for the trees because they're competing for scarce water, but that means they're actually using a lot more water that should be going into underground reservoirs or coming downstream, right? And so what's that balance of thinning out the forest to a point that it's watershed healthy, right? And like Scott Stevens was estimating, it's about 40 trees per acre, but you've got UC Merced and some others working on watershed studies that show you that correlation between forest thinning and forest recovery and water yield, because that's how we get some water districts, like LA Municipal Water District is investing in upper watersheds now finally. We've got water districts throughout the state that are now investing in these upper watersheds. And it's allowed me to make the case at the policy level at this Federal Fire Commission that says, hey, can we classify our upper watersheds as critical infrastructure, meaning we actually invest in the maintenance of the upper watersheds the same way you would in the maintenance of a dam, and so that you're actually thinking about the natural infrastructure that we have in place. And so the state is putting out dollars, right, for grants to be able to promote research to help us answer these questions. But for me, it was really critical that we then reinvest and then not just have these questions out and hope somebody uses it, or have these data sets out and hope somebody uses it, but that we reinvest and actually use the science to make the policy decisions. And that's where these partnerships are so critical. And so we're using, we partnered with Google to take all of the fire and ecological modeling that we have available through the UC system and through our partners, and actually turn it into a tool that somebody at a resource conservation district or a fire safe council could use to design their fuel breaks, so that you could have future climate modeling in there, know what direction the wind's going to come from in 20 years, right? That you can have the opportunities for biodiversity listed in there, so that you know, okay, I'm going to do a fuel break and I should do it with grazing because that's going to enhance this species, right? That's local. And so that it allows not just to have the science stored in a nice, neat little package, but actually at the fingertips and easy and intuitively able to use to people who are actually delivering the projects on the ground, so that we are learning that critical lesson of 1905, right, of making sure that the implementation of this actually stays pace with the science.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I think we have a reception we're supposed to be doing with some food we're supposed to be eating. So I think let's give our speaker a hand, and then take an opportunity to maybe ask a few more questions or talk to Jessica a bit more while we eat a little bit. Okay?
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to turn this off.